The BRIC currency, I think, is a misnomer. It will not be a currency. There isn't enough gold on the planet, almost irrespective of the price you put on gold, to backstop all of the domestic transactions in a group of countries whose GDP is larger than the G7's.
Yeah.
The idea that they're going to have a common currency and politically suborn their individual national interests to the common good of the BRICS is a silly, silly fantasy.
The BRICS bloc, a group of developing countries seen as seeking to counter the United States and the West, agreed at a summit last week to admit 6 new countries: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. At the summit, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva called for the BRICS countries to create a common currency for trade and investment to reduce the dominance of the US dollar. According to Rick Rule, the notion of a BRICS currency is somewhat of a misnomer, as he believes it won't function as a traditional currency. The New Development Bank, a financial institution created by the BRICS bloc of emerging markets, has no immediate plans for the group to develop a common currency. The renowned analyst sees that BRICS won't become a widely used currency, but suggests the potential for a gold-backed settlement mechanism, allowing countries with trade surpluses such as China and Russia to settle transactions in gold. Regarding the value of the US dollar, Rule criticizes the Consumer Price Index, CPI, as a fraudulent index that, in his opinion, guarantees negative rates of return to investors. Additionally, he highlights the weaponization of the US dollar by the US government, where it can potentially default on or cancel debt held by foreign nations. This use of financial leverage as a geopolitical tool extends to mechanisms like the SWIFT banking system, allowing the US to exert extraterritorial influence on global financial transactions. Rule argues that these actions contribute to the ongoing and gradual decline of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. We will now bring you clips from Rick Rule's interview with Mike Maloney, but before we do, if you want more videos like this, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell for more updates. Thank you, and enjoy the video.
I think a multipolar world is a good thing. And I think that there was no domestic impetus necessarily for the expansion of the BRICS. I think that the biggest enemy of the US dollar is not in Beijing or Moscow, it's in Washington.
Yes.
If you look at what we as Americans made them do, you have to look, first of all, to the fact that the deepest and most liquid securities market in the world is the US Treasury market. And we're doing our best to wreck it. We're doing our best to wreck it because we're wrecking the credit quality of the issuer, the US government. At the same time that, separate and apart from the CPI, which I think is a fraudulent index, we are
CPI.
Yeah, we're guaranteeing people negative rates of return. When I construct a basket of the goods and services that I buy, I include government in my index, which the CPI doesn't include. And if you measure your cost of living the way I measure mine, the deterioration of the purchasing power of the US dollar is much closer to 7% than it is to 3%. So with regards to the US Treasury, if you buy a Treasury that's yielding you now 5%, in a currency that's losing you 7% a year, the real yield on your Treasury is -2%. That's not particularly attractive to the Koreans and the Chinese and the Saudis. And if you put on top of that the weaponization of the US dollar, the fact that if the US government doesn't approve of your policies, they can default, they can cancel on the debt you hold. And if you weaponize it, like we did through the SWIFT banking system, the extraterritorial imposition of US values on the rest of the world guarantees the slow motion decline of the US dollar as the reserves currency. The BRIC currency, I think, is a misnomer. It will not be a currency. However, a gold-backed settlement mechanism where the trade surplus that China enjoys, as an example, with Russia, could be settled outside the US dollar system in gold, I think is a very interesting concept. I actually don't think it's going to occur because I think as little as the Russians and the Chinese trust us, they trust each other even less. I could see a circumstance where Xi went to Moscow and said, you guys owe us the equivalent of $10 billion in gold, please settle up. And I could see Mr. Putin saying to them, well, here's 100,000 bricks. And I don't mean gold bricks. I mean settlement bricks. I just don't see them trusting each other enough to make this mechanism work, except for in a very, very, very limited fashion for a settlements mechanism.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be redeemable for the consumer, for instance. Right.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And ultimately, given that only 2 of the BRICS members run consistent trade surpluses, I don't think it'll be viable among the BRICS. At some point in time, U.S. hegemony gets replaced by the threat of Chinese hegemony.
Right.
I mean, this is just the nature of politics.
The recent collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, has sent shockwaves throughout the financial sector, making it the second largest bank failure in U.S. history. The tech-focused lender could not raise fresh capital after a run on deposits, which led to emergency measures by U.S. regulators. Rule expresses that the current crisis involving Silicon Valley Bank and the broader banking community is manageable due to the high confidence level in the financial system. He emphasizes that banking relies heavily on confidence and that a critical question arises when this confidence diminishes. One of Rick Rule's primary concerns is the proliferation of high-yield exchange-traded funds, ETFs, investing in low-quality securities. These ETFs hold trillions of dollars in assets and are readily tradable. Investors might start redeeming them if there is a widespread loss of confidence in these ETFs. This would force the ETF managers to sell the illiquid underlying assets, potentially causing a cascading effect. Let's get back to the interview.
I believe that the crisis represented by Silicon Valley Bank, by the banking community, is manageable because there's so much confidence in the system. Banking is all about confidence.
But what happens when the confidence evaporates?
That's a very, very, very real question. If we have a circumstance like 2008, where a so-called black swan gets in the way, a crisis can evaporate very quickly. And in that sense, the assets of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation are nowhere near sufficient to handle the mark-to-market losses in the banking system. But let's set that aside just for a second. We have a circumstance where I think that the system itself is over-leveraged at every level. I think, obviously, in the United States, at least, that the federal government is over-leveraged. Many state governments are over-leveraged. Many municipalities are over-leveraged. And many of your listeners are over-leveraged. And what that means is that if you have a sort of an asymptomatic event, even if some people have foreseen it, the damage that can do to the broad economy, but also to confidence, is something that individual investors have to insure against. And I do think that the banking system, ex-federal support, is really challenged. You and I talked, Mike, a couple of months ago about the fact that humankind in the period 1982 to 2022 lived through 40 years of the most benign economic climate experienced. And the consequence of that is, I think that people became overly complacent, they became overly confident, and they didn't prepare as well as they should to take care of themselves in circumstances where liquidity was required. And I think that sets the stage for the sort of difficulties that you describe. By the way, I'm not a gloomster. I think 10 years from now, we'll be better off than we are today. I'm just afraid that we have a reckoning to go through to get from there. But let's look at some things that scare me. And I'll tell you the thing that scares me the most. If I was looking for, black swans in the United States, the thing that scares me absolutely the most is the proliferation of high yield exchange traded funds, ETFs that invest in junk securities. There's several $1 trillion worth of this stuff, and they're highly liquid, and they're owned in small amounts by a bunch of people that I don't think have done enough work to understand the underlying security. These people, in the rude parlance of Wall Street, are yield whores. And what scares me is that although the ETFs are highly liquid, the underlying securities that they own are highly illiquid. And if we have a concern about credit that reaches the common man, if you will, and if they begin to redeem those ETFs, the managers are forced to sell the underlying assets. And of course, the best assets are the most liquid. They get sold the first. What really scares me is you have a circumstance where there's broad spread redemption in the junk ETFs, and the underlying bonds don't have sufficient liquidity to fund the redemptions. That circumstance in my younger years, or that asset class, these junk bonds, become described as owl bonds. We call them owl bonds because when the portfolio manager calls the broker to sell the bond, the broker says, "Too-hoo, too-hoo." And a circumstance where you have a run on the bank that's represented by an ETF. I mean, if you want my single biggest fear, that's it. I hope it doesn't materialize, but I sort of feel like privately placed high yield corporate debt is the mortgage-backed security of this decade. And Michael, honest to God, I hope I'm wrong.
If the dominance of the US dollar fades substantially in the future, it will likely have more to do with poor management of the US economy, such as ballooning deficits, than with any BRICS efforts to dethrone it. Do you believe that BRICS currency is likely to replace the US dollar in future? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. If you found this video informative, remember to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and enable notifications to stay informed about our latest videos on silver, gold, and copper. Thank you for watching, and we appreciate your support.